Hello, everyone. Well, it's been a pretty crazy couple of weeks since the UTMB. For years, I've really happily operated just in the shadow of obscurity, but it seems that's not going to be the case any longer. Since that amazing day in Chamonix, where Tom Evans and Ruth Croft won their respective overall classes, I have received hundreds of emails, texts, and direct messages on my Instagram account, which, by the way, I am now beginning to monitor, which I really never did before. So to say that this has been overwhelming is a bit of an understatement. Along with all of those congratulatory messages have come some questions, many of which are on similar topics. So I've decided to reply to everyone who received those messages. And if you didn't hear back from me, please accept my apology for the oversight. I've worked really hard to make sure I wasn't overlooking anyone. Um, but in order to address some of the questions that have come in, which are, again, a lot on similar topics, I've decided to record two podcasts that should address some of these two most common questions I've been getting. So I will be delivering this talk using a script. So if it sounds like I'm reading it, well, I am. And that's because I want to represent or I want to present it clearly and not leave anything out. Um, because it's kind of needing, it's a little complicated and it needs to, I need to present it in a certain order so that people will understand it. So this is not going to be slick. I am the farthest thing from an influencer, but I do think you're going to find it informative. You may even find it a bit blasphemous that I'm challenging one of the foundations of exercise science. I've always been a really curious person. And some of that curiosity led to some unfortunate results, like when I was 11 years old and I took the family record player apart to see how it worked. But other times, it's led to experimentation that resulted in some pretty special inventions and a few patents, and some outside the box training methods. So buckle up. I'm titling this podcast, How We Don't Train. So the issue of VO2 max keeps coming up. And this is a subject and a training methodology that I have devoted many hours to studying and years of implementing. In fact, in digging through my huge collection of studies and literature, most of which are in a paper form from pre-internet days, I came across a study I first read in 1984, just as it had been released. I'm going to talk more about this study and who conducted it and how it began to shape my thinking on the subject of VO2 max. So I'm not exaggerating that I have been studying VO2 max, not only in scientific literature, but in my own experiments and experiential use with other athletes for literally decades. From about 1980 to 2000, I experimented with VO2 max focused workouts on myself and athletes I was coaching. In today's talk, I'm going to talk about why I don't ascribe to this type of training. I'm going to deal broadly with the concept of VO2 max. I'm going to talk about its history, why it became a central concept in exercise science, the legitimacy of using it as a gold standard of endurance, and the fallacy of focusing training on improving this quality or quantity, however you want to say. By the end of this, I'm hopeful that you'll understand why Tom Evans and Ruth Croft, who won UTMB in their respective classes, with all of the successes they've had since working with me for several years now, have never done a single VO2 max workout. So every day, YouTube, social media influencers, podcasters, the blogosphere, they're brimming with posts about VO2 max being the gold standard measure of endurance performance. Well, I'm here to tell you that it just ain't so. Or at the very least, it is deserving of a highly nuanced discussion that it rarely gets outside of scientific literature. And that's what I'm hoping to touch on today, is some of that nuance and some of the questions that arise around this type of training. Maybe you've read statements in the scientific literature like this from Midgley in 2006, quote, "The maximal oxygen uptake, VO2 max, has been suggested to be the single most important physiological capacity in determining endurance running performance," end quote. Or perhaps you've heard influencers say that VO2 max is the gold standard of fitness. These ideas have taken root in the lay fitness information sphere. There are many good coaches who promote the use of VO2 max training. However, there's also a great deal of scientific literature along with a similarly huge amount of empirical evidence from the coaching world, my own specific examples I'm going to show you, that at the very least should make you stop and consider some serious questions about VO2 max type training. So first, let's dive a little bit into the history. It's important to know at least a bit about history in order to understand how it has come to play such a central role in sports science. So in the 18th century, Lavoisier and Laplace, and if the name Laplace sounds familiar, it's because he's really famous in integral calculus for coming up with the Laplace transform. And anybody who's ever had to study this will probably remember that name and the Laplace transform. So those two guys discovered that muscle contractions consumed oxygen and emitted CO2. And later, in the early 20th century, a British physiologist named A.V. Hill, I think it was Archibald Hill, conducted a series of experiments to determine the limiting factor when it came to the amount of work a human could do over the course of time, like in a minute. He did this by running while wearing a large bag on his back and capturing his expired breath. By analyzing the relative concentrations of oxygen versus carbon dioxide in both the air inside the bag and then comparing that to the ambient concentrations, Hill was able to evaluate the amount of oxygen that his body took up and used during exercise. This quantity became known as VO2. Hill observed that there was an upper limit to VO2, VO2 max, so to speak. No matter how fast he ran, the VO2 would not go up. So his conclusions, in his own words, were, to quote him, "In running, the oxygen requirement increases continuously as the speed increases, attaining enormous values at the highest speeds. The actual oxygen uptake, however, reaches a maximum, beyond which no effort can drive it. The oxygen intake may attain its maximal and remain constant merely because it cannot go any higher owing to the limitations of the circulatory and respiratory systems, in other words, the heart and lungs," end quote. So Hill's conclusion that the maximal oxygen uptake was limited by the heart's ability to supply blood has endured as the most likely limiting factor in human endurance. Hill was awarded the Nobel Prize in Medicine for this discovery, and as a result, this has become one of the foundational principles of exercise science. So with Hill being one of the pioneers of exercise science, that also explains why VO2 max has become viewed as a cornerstone for research and the level of importance to which it has been ascribed. But let's look at some problems associated with this idea. First, for those of you that have studied anything related to physics or engineering, notice that Hill is not making a statement about endurance with that quote that I just read you. He's actually making a statement about the maximal amount of aerobic work that could be done per minute. Recall from physics that work divided by time is a measure of power. So this concept of VO2 max is actually describing the maximal aerobic power. While maximum power and endurance could be related, they're certainly not directly interchangeable. So this is just one of the problems we encounter when we start looking more deeply at VO2 max as an actual measure of endurance. Another is that if the heart is in fact the limiter of aerobic power, why is it that when you test an athlete a tested athlete recruits more muscle mass by adding the arms, such as in a quadrupedal sport like cross-country skiing, why does the VO2 max increase over when that same athlete is tested using legs only? If the heart was at its limit in the legs, how could it have more capacity when the arms are added? So that's another problem that hasn't been answered by this VO2 max model of endurance. So if you're with me so far, don't worry, it only gets more nuanced. One of the things that helped muddy the waters on this subject is that it was observed that high-level endurance athletes had higher VO2 max values than less well-trained and especially sedentary people. So because of this, many people fell into the trap that correlation implies causation. And then they came to this conclusion that the high VO2 max was responsible for those elite athletes' high performance. And many studies, which we're going to get to in a moment, have shown that the correlation between endurance performance and VO2 max is remarkably weak. So let's examine the idea that endurance athletes should be training to improve their VO2 max because somehow this will improve their performance. So in a 2017 metadata study, anybody that's familiar with metadata studies knows what this means. That is a study that looks at a whole bunch of other studies to try to see trends and so that's basically what this one did. And this study was called Defining the Determinants of Endurance Running Performance in Heat. Now, the heat part isn't as important to our discussion today, but it kind of is relevant because most of these heat becomes a pretty big factor in most ultra endurance running events. It wasn't such a big deal at this year's UTMB where it snowed and rained a lot. But this study examined about a dozen studies that used similar methods in order to, that were trying to discover the correlation of a bunch of different metrics to the time trial performance of well-trained endurance athletes at distances ranging from 3 to 10 kilometers. About half the studies examined what are called heterogeneous groups, and I'm going to explain these meanings in a moment, but they examined heterogeneous groups, meaning athletes of quite different performance levels, and half the studies considered what they call homogeneous group runners, meaning these are runners with very similar performance level. In the studies involving heterogeneous runners, there was a much greater correlation between race results and the athlete's speed at their anaerobic or their second threshold. In fact, that correlation was about 80 to 90%. Whereas comparing it to that group of athletes' race performance to their VO2 max resulted in a correlation of only about 65%. And then when they started testing homogeneous cohorts of athletes, in other words, athletes who had similar performance levels, then the difference became even more pronounced. Among those with similar running performances, the correlation between the performance and VO2 max was even worse, and in fact, some cases, some of the studies had less than 50% of the results could be explained by the performance results could be explained by higher VO2 max. And while the correlation between the speed at the anaerobic threshold compared to their race outcome was about 95%. In other words, about 95% of the difference in the performance could be explained by their speed at their anaerobic threshold or the second threshold. So the takeaway is that even in these extremely short races, or not extremely, but even in these relatively short races, the speed at the anaerobic threshold was a far better predictor than VO2 max of the performance outcome of the athlete. So for those of you that are a bit rusty with the statistical term correlation, let me explain a minute. It indicates the relationship of one variable, in this case, the VO2 max, to a second variable, in this case, endurance performance or race performance. And it's denoted by the lowercase r. So in statistics, an R value of 1 indicates a perfect correlation. This would be the case where correlation did, in fact, equal causation. But an R value of 0 indicates there's literally no connection between these two variables. So now I want to talk about a caveat that's important to. This is one of those nuanced things, so bear with me for a moment. So it's important to understand that all things being equal, an athlete with a very high VO2 max, like let's say 70 or 80 milliliters per kilogram, is almost always going to outperform and have better endurance performance than one with a low VO2 max, like let's say 40 milliliters per kilogram. There's just no way those two people are going to be competitive. This is what we mean by a heterogeneous grouping. This is where we have, these people they don't have very similar VO2 max, and they're not going to have similar performances. So are not related. And this is where that's the highest correlation between VO2 max and performance. Whereas athletes, while these athletes, they're in the same race, but they're not competing with one another. Let's be clear. Let's be honest about that. Whereas in a homogeneous group of athletes, either in the range, let's say either looking at the athlete with a bunch of athletes around 40 milliliters per kilogram per minute, which is a modest VO2 max, or 80, or the group that has around 80 milliliter per kilogram per minute VO2 max, will show a really poor correlation between their VO2 max among their own group. And so you can see that. So I'm gonna go into a little deeper dive on this, and I think it'll make it clear here in just a second here. So that 1984 study that I mentioned at the very beginning was conducted by Peter Snell, who's a PhD in exercise science and was a speaker, instructor at University of Texas. So, and that study, when I read that in 1984, it was one of the most impactful studies. It was the first evidence that I'd ever seen from looking at real world athletes that VO2 max and performance were very poorly correlated. So this paper that he wrote was delivered at the 1984 Symposium on Exercise, dealing with physiology and the clinical application thereof. So the interesting thing is here, some of you may even remember the name Peter Snell, but not only was he an instructor in internal medicine at the University of Texas, he was also a former world record holder in the mile, and he is still the only person to have won a gold medal in both the 800 and the 1500 meter running events in the same Olympic Games. So this guy has it covered. He's got the scientific side covered. He's got the athletic side covered. And so he wasn't really purely just a scientist, but he had this depth of experience and understanding of the real world and the evidence of endurance athletes. In this study, which he titled "The Role of Maximum Oxygen Uptake," or max VO2, as we call it today, in exercise performance, he covered a huge amount of ground in this study, and I'm not going to go into the details. I can put a link in if people are interested. You can contact me. It's pretty hard to find this. I actually just have a paper copy of it, and I'm not sure if it's available online. But the main thing that jumped out at me in 1884 and has been reinforced over the years with more evidence was the comparison that he made. He compared the men's mile record hold times to the VO2 max values of the holders of those records, covering the period from the late 30s into the mid 1980s, just before he published the test. So why would he look at the 1 mile times? Because according to many studies, that's about the maximum distance or the maximum amount of time that the VO2 max can actually be maintained. So this would mean that an athlete's VO2 max would be the limit of the aerobic power in a 1 mile run. So if anything was going to test VO2 max, it would be this 1 mile run. And VO2 max in this case should, theoretically, if people who prescribe to the notion that VO2 max is a good predictor of endurance performance, VO2 max should have a very strong correlation with the performance in a 1 mile race. But when you graph the data that he presents, and I did this in an Excel spreadsheet, you graph the times and the VO2 max of all of these athletes that were at world record level in those roughly 50-year period, about 45 years actually. And you fit a trend line to them, calculating the R, or the correlation value. That R value comes out to equal about 0.125. What this means is that using VO2 max as a predictor of the mile world record time would be accurate about 12.5% of the time. In other words, it's only about a 12% useful tool it correlates about 12, VO2 max correlates about 12% of the time with the athlete's performance. And any statistical look at data, this would be basically saying there's almost no correlation between VO2 max and world record. Now that you know something about homogeneous groups, I think you can see why Snell chose the world record holder. You can't get a more homogeneous grouping than the very best mile runners in the world. In this group, the correlation between VO2 max and race performance breaks down completely. Remember that among well-trained groups, like homogeneous groups, the correlation was kind of poor at around 50 or 60%, but it was definitely not off the charts worthless like it is in Snell's example. So should we even train to improve VO2 max? Many studies and my own experience show that improvements in performance are not linked to improvements in VO2 max, especially in well-trained, but not necessarily elite athletes. By this, I mean the athletically mature athlete. So one who has been training consistently for several years. Many other studies and my own experience also show that in well-trained athletes, VO2 max doesn't change despite the best efforts of doing so using VO2, quote unquote, VO2 max training. In a study by Jones in 1998, he showed that a female Olympic 3,000 meter runner, and again, that's an event that should rely very heavily on VO2 max because of its short nature, her best time improved by 46 seconds, while her VO2 max dropped from 72 milliliters per kilogram to 66 milliliters per kilogram. So roughly a 10% decline in her VO2 max during this period, and her performance in a 3,000 meter race. So this would have been about a 8.5 minute, 9 minute race, improved by 3/4 of a minute. So substantial improvement in performance while her VO2 max declined. That same Jones, who was also the coach, not only a researcher, but also and a medical doctor as well, but he was also the coach of Paula Radcliffe, who until recently held the women's world marathon record. And he said that over her career, her VO2 max remained completely stable despite a multi-fold increase in both training volume and intensity. So here was someone who was already what I would call athletically fairly mature, and no matter what kind of training he threw at her, VO2 max did not change. Another very well publicized case with an athlete that everyone will know the name of is that a number of years ago, almost before the whole hoopla and the discovery of Lance Armstrong's cheating became so public, that Lance Armstrong's coach said that Lance's VO2 max declined over the course of his career. All the time, all the while, his performance was increasing. Now, granted, he was a cheat, but this actually adds additional credence that it was not Lance's VO2 max that impacted his improved performance. So one of his cheating methods was to use the synthetic erythropoietin, or EPO. So EPO is the natural hormone produced in the liver that stimulates red blood cell production. Just as breathing a higher concentration of oxygen than normal will elevate a person's VO2 max, having a higher red blood cell concentration that allows more oxygen to be delivered to the muscles will also raise the VO2 max. So if anything should have raised Lance's VO2 max, it should have been the EPO. Yet his VO2 max went down even as his performance increased. And I coached a world-class cross-country skier who, while a member of the U.S. ski team, had been using VO2 max training for over 5 years, administered under very carefully controlled testing and training in the misguided hopes of his coaches that elevating his VO2 max would improve his race results. The end result of all this was that he was let go from the U.S. ski team for underperformance. So he came to work with me, and immediately following his release from the ski team, so I had access to all of his training logs, all of his test data over about 10 years. And remarkably, despite all the time and the money, and there were probably close to over $1 million spent on this guy to do this, And all the effort, his VO2 max remained at about 73 milliliters per kilogram per minute over the course of about 10 years. No change whatsoever, despite them literally throwing the book at his training. So I knew right away that we were not going to change his VO2 max. He was at probably a genetic limit at that point. So I shifted his training to focus on improving both his second threshold or anaerobic threshold speed and his economy at his racing speeds. So an extra, for those of you who haven't heard that term, economy, exercise economy is defined as the oxygen cost of exercise. And we were most interested in the oxygen cost of his exercise at racing speeds. Interestingly enough, within, I guess we had about 5 months of training before the next racing season started. And the very next season, he was back being one of the best U.S. skiers, and he went on to his fourth Olympics. And we did absolutely no VO2 max training. So some other things you might want to know about VO2 max. It's often referred to as a first wave adaptation to training. This means that the untrained will see a fairly rapid gain in this quantity. So in about a 36-week study that was conducted in 1984 by the famed running coach and exercise physiologist Jack Daniels, who, by the way, is a big proponent of VO2 max training, or was, it showed that the VO2 max increased almost 15% among untrained individuals during the first 24 weeks of that 36-week study, but then it didn't improve anymore after that. Another earlier study by Daniels in 1978 showed that those new to training saw a big jump in VO2 max in the first few weeks, but then they saw no increase just after that, despite an increase in both training volume and training intensity, even though their performance continued to improve. So the fact that VO2 max doesn't correlate well with endurance performance, coupled with the fact that it's almost impossible to improve improve VO2 max in those with several years of consistent training behind them, should definitely make you question why people are saying that VO2 max is any sort of gold standard of endurance. I could go on with many, many more examples, both in scientific literature and in my own experience of cases where the correlation between VO2 max and performance is weak at best, or in some cases it actually has, as I've just explained, it actually has a negative correlation. VO2 max goes down, performance goes up. Bringing all this background information together, I now want to shift my talk to improving endurance performance and why I don't use what we call VO2 max training. Only in the shorter and most intense events do endurance athletes achieve VO2 max during their event. When it comes to events lasting several hours, like most of this audience is competing in or at least interested in, where the average intensity is somewhere between the first or the aerobic threshold and the second or the anaerobic threshold at around 60 to 80% of the VO2 max, that's where we're competing. We're not competing anywhere close to VO2 max. So the aerobic, you're right in there between the aerobic and anaerobic threshold. And because if an athlete exceeds the second threshold, that anaerobic threshold, in a multi-hour event, there's going to be some serious consequences in terms of performance degradation. Anybody who's gone out too hard or pushed too hard on a big uphill knows what that means. You are going to have to really slow down to allow your body to recover. So at the ultra endurance intensity levels, the heart has way more capacity to deliver oxygenated blood to the muscles than those muscles have to take up and utilize the oxygen. So the heart's definitely not the limiter in ultra long distance events. So why all the emphasis on VO2 max training, which works by increasing the heart's output or its stroke volume? Remember, back to what Hill said, is the limitation is really in the central pumping system. It's the heart's ability to deliver enough oxygen. Well, how does the heart go about delivering more oxygen to the rest of the working muscles? One way is to increase the heart rate, which we've all seen happen. As you increase the intensity of your training, your heart rate goes up. And the second way is to increase what's called the stroke volume. Now, this is the volume of blood that's ejected with each beat of the heart. So with stroke, and it was determined that stroke volume was the biggest limiter to VO2 max. So with stroke volume setting that limit to VO2 max, that was best demonstrated by a study done by an old acquaintance of mine, Dr. Jim Stray-Gunderson. This is the same Stray-Gunderson responsible for the sleep high, train low methodology that's still very much in vogue today and has proven itself useful for decades now. Anyway, Jim's seminal study tested the VO2 max of retired greyhound race dogs. Then they cut the dog's pericardium and retested them, and they discovered a big increase in stroke volume and VO2 max. Now, for those of you that don't know about anatomy and what the pericardium is, it's the actual fascial sac that holds the heart, keeps the heart from bouncing around in its cavity there in your chest, but it also constrains the heart in the amount of that the heart muscle can expand. And because the pericardium is not elastic really almost at all, it constrains the heart's ability to fill, and therefore its stroke volume, the amount of blood it can eject with each beat of the heart. But once the pericardium in these dogs was cut, the heart was able to fill with more blood, and as a result, it could eject more blood with each beat. So now we have another reason to doubt the efficacy of VO2 max training. But not only that, but we also have a reason to doubt the rationale of using it when training for ultra endurance events. If your heart has way more capacity than it needs to provide the blood and oxygen to those working muscles at these rather moderate intensities that these events are competed at, then what's the importance of massively increasing the, not suggesting anybody have their pericardium cut. That would be a fatal mistake. But what would be the point of working so hard to increase the stroke volume and hence the VO2 max if you're not using that maximum volume? Now I want to talk a little bit about the challenges of executing proper VO2 max training. So a typical VO2 max workout is done at an intensity which is above the second or anaerobic threshold in what we do call zone 4, and at around 90 to 95% of the maximum heart rate, which is about where an athlete reaches 100% of their VO2 max. So many proponents of this training, including the famed Jack Daniels that I've mentioned before, say that the goal of this type of training is to spend as much time at VO2 max as possible. And to do this, you need to use interval style work. And in fact, this is how interval training was invented in the 30s by a couple of German exercise scientists whom I could talk about at another time. They found out that an athlete could do more hard work if they broke the hard work into shorter segments and they separated it by rest intervals. But in the case of VO2 max type training, where it usually involves is a work period, doing repeated work periods of about 3 to 5 minutes, where they're separated by a rest interval of a similar length. So the problem is that outside the careful confines of a lab, what I often see in practice, or have seen for many, many years with many, many athletes, that in practice, what most people do is they train too hard in these workouts. So this is hard training, and it can be, it's really difficult to control the intensity in this type of training. So it feels hard, and the difference between hard and too hard is pretty darn hard, pretty darn difficult, I should say, to ascertain, to discern. You may have even had this experience. Let's say you plan to go do a VO2 max workout of, say, 4 or 5 by 4 minutes with a 4-minute rest in between. That's a really typical VO2 max type workout. So the first couple of repetitions go okay. But then during numbers 3 and 4 and 5, you can no longer cover the same distance, and your heart rate is getting lower and it falls down below that 90 to 95% target. So now, not only are you not getting the stimulus to the heart muscle that is supposed to be key to this type of training, but that's what's desired by, the people who are promoting this sort of thing. But you're also training really hard to go slower. Now, this kind of training will definitely make you tougher mentally for sure, because you're going to suffer a lot in this kind of training. Trust me, I've done many of these type of workouts myself. But unfortunately, the awards at races are handed out to the fastest runners, not the toughest runners. And I'm convinced that this can actually even derail people's training when they get into this routine of just training hard. It says to do, 5 by 4 minutes at a certain, you're going to run up a hill. It can be a pretty typical workout for a trail runner to do run uphill for 5 minutes, then jog back down, do the same thing. That these things can be incredibly damaging and lead to overtraining. And that's because this high intensity type of training imposes an extraordinary global stress on the entire body. Cortisol levels, which is the stress hormone, just go through the roof with this kind of training. So most people do not understand or even acknowledge that the effects of this kind of of this type of VO2 max training. But one thing I am quite confident of, have never read a study to this effect, but anybody who's done this kind of training can tell you that this is what that feels like, is that this type of training is incredibly demanding muscularly. So it has a powerful muscular endurance training effect. So it could be that some of the performance improvements that people experience when using high intensity training to improve their VO2 max are actually caused by an improvement in muscular endurance training and not necessarily an improvement in their VO2 max. So the other problem with this type of training, as I mentioned about how stressful it is, this high intensity training lengthens the recovery time that's needed before the next challenging training session can be handled. The intensity of these workouts also limits the volume of training in each session dramatically. And since the volume of any sort of training is the main stimulus for adaptation, this high intensity training can be self-limiting, or actually, in fact, it is self-limiting. You just can't do more of it. So this leads to the question in my mind, and this is what caused me to rethink some of this years ago, is it better to train at a much higher volume at a slightly reduced intensity, especially when the training, especially now that I'm coaching people in this ultra endurance world where the events are of a really long duration? And what I have found is that training at an intensity below the second threshold can increase the tolerable volume by several fold at a much reduced stress. So remember, in the end, that endurance sports are contests of who can maintain the highest speed for the longest. They are not contests of who can achieve the highest numbers in a lab. So why would you train a performance? Why would you train a proxy for performance like VO2 max, and a rather poor one at that, rather than actually training performance itself? What I and all the Evoke Endurance coaches focus on is improving the performance of the athlete. We have found that we can make sizable gains in endurance performance by focusing on other elements, which will be covered in the second podcast in this series. So I'm going to leave you with the following questions. If you've been using high intensity training to improve your VO2 max, has your VO2 max improved? Did you do a lab test before engaging in a concentrated block of VO2 max training? And then did you follow it up with another lab test to test VO2 max in the same lab, same protocol? If not, how do you know your VO2 max improved? Or are you just trusting all the crap you hear and read about online about the importance of VO2 max? If you aren't testing and you do see an improvement in performance, what tells you it's come from VO2 max and not from some other adaptation? So in part 2 of this podcast series, I'm going to talk about what we do to train and why we do it. Until then, thanks again for the amazing outpouring of support and all the congratulations. I am really humbled by what I have seen coming my way. And I feel incredibly lucky to have had the opportunity to work with two such talented and gracious athletes as Tom and Ruth. For them to have put their professional futures in my hands a few years ago, before many people even knew who I was or what my training ideas were, was a real gamble on their part, and it shows the confidence in me that I definitely do not take lightly. And to them, I am eternally grateful. See you next time.